to this welcome to this panel discussion on racial justice in the U.S. from a human rights perspective. I want to particularly welcome graduate school faculty, staff, and students who are joining today as part of our fall convocation. So welcome to all of you. This panel is the first in a global perspective series sponsored by the Center for Global Engagement called Human Rights at Home. This series is designed to bring forth the language and concepts of international human rights into current discussions of racial justice and access to healthcare in the United States. We hope you'll join us for the subsequent sessions on the experiences of Black UMB students, scholars, and alumni from a global and local perspective on October 13th, and health as a human right in the United States, what COVID-19 has exposed on November 17th, and you'll see invitations to those. Today's esteemed panelists come from multiple professional backgrounds. Our moderator is Dr. Roger Ward. He's the Dean of the University of Maryland Graduate School and Interim Provost and Executive Vice President. The discussants are Russell McClain, Professor of Law and Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at University of Maryland Carey School of Law. Peter Danchin, who's a Professor of Law and Director of the International and Comparative Law Program at University of Maryland Carey Law School. Neijma Celestine-Donner, who's Assistant Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at University of Maryland School of Social Work, and our one guest from outside the walls of UMB, who we're very honored to welcome, Dr. Jackie Smith, Professor of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh and co-coordinator of the Pittsburgh Human Rights City Alliance. Many thanks to all of you. Just one housekeeping note, this is a big panel about a big topic, so the hour is going to pass very quickly. Dr. Ward will try and save 10 minutes at the end for questions. So please send me, Virginia Rowthorn, your questions directly, and I will share them with Dr. Ward if we have time at the end. So now I will turn it over to you, Dr. Ward.
Thank you, Virginia, and thank you, panelists, for agreeing to participate in this important conversation. I don't think I've ever been handed a more difficult task, which is trying to reduce in 1 hour a very meaty and important topic, an important conversation on human rights. I'm told that, you know, we're to try to grapple with two big questions. The first is, although the US was a leading proponent of universal human rights after World War II, why did the US then take such a divergent path from most other nations on human rights and instead went down the path of civil rights? And the second question, which again we'll try to at least touch on and grapple with, is would adoption of human rights or the human rights language and concepts, the way the other world, the rest of the world sees it, help us understand and address systemic racism and deal with it in better ways than we have so far? So those are the two big overarching questions that we will try to do justice in the time that we have. And so if I may, as the facilitator of the conversation, sort of like lay out the roadmap of how I would like to at least use the panelists' time and expertise to try to get to these questions. And I'm hoping the panelists are amenable to this roadmap because we didn't have a chance to discuss it in advance. So first, I'll start with our external guests because that is, I think, the appropriate place to start, and ask Professor Smith, if you will, to set the table for us by grounding us in the, if you will, the history of human rights, the struggle for human rights, and how that struggle might have been reduced to a struggle, and I use the word struggle, and reduced to civil rights in the United States, and what efforts are underway currently to try to bring that language of human rights to the United States in a very action-oriented way. I'll then ask Professor McClain from our School of Law to talk about the concept of American exceptionalism and how that thinking might influence, from your perspective, the lens through which America evaluates its treatment of its Black and brown citizens. Then I'll ask our colleague from the School of Social Work, Dean Celestine-Donner, to opine, and I know you have well-formed thoughts on how the adoption of the language of civil rights over the language of human rights might have disconnected Black and brown people in the United States from the rest of the people of the African diaspora, who are essentially engaged in the same struggle relative to the rights that they are pursuing. And then, of course, turn to the other lawyer on the panel, Professor Danchin, on, again, talking about how this quest for human rights coincides, intersects with the civil rights movement here, the Black Lives Matter movement, and how that movement might have been taken internationally by George Floyd's brother's presentation before the Human Rights Council, and what should we take from his appearance there and the implications for the movement. And of course, as Virginia said, we'd like to leave time at the end for questions. And even though I've sort of laid out in the roadmap, giving the panelists, directing them to specific topics, I'm hoping that others who bring expertise to those questions feel free to weigh in as well. And we will try to leave time for questions, but we'll see how that goes. Again, it's a very meaty topic. So that's the plan, and I'm sticking to it. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. My grandmother used to always say, if you want to give the Lord a good laugh, tell him what your plan is. So we'll see how it goes. So maybe Professor Smith, let me start with a quote that I read in a piece that you co-authored. It's a quote from Malcolm X, and maybe that's an appropriate place to start. And the quote says, Malcolm X said, when you expand the civil rights struggle to the level of human rights, you can then take the case of the Black man in this country, speaking of America, of course, before the nations of the UN. You can take it before the General Assembly. You can take Uncle Sam before a world court. But the only level you can do it on is the level of human rights. Civil rights keeps you under his restrictions, under his jurisdiction. Civil rights keep you in his pocket. So help us understand, Professor Smith, the important point you think Malcolm X was trying to make here as it relates to understanding the distinction between human rights and civil rights.
All right, am I able to share a couple slides with folks on the screen?
Sure. Who's hosting? Lauren? Yeah,
I see that I have the share screen button. So thank you for that introduction and for setting up the stage right where I wanted to start with Malcolm X. And I'm going to share just a little bit from the work I'm doing with the Pittsburgh Human Rights City Alliance, and also as part of a national network of human rights organizers and human rights city leaders who are working together to share stories and lessons and to really support and encourage more organizing at the local level around the human rights framework. And what we've been doing in both of these, at both Pittsburgh and nationally, is a lot of human rights education and really helping people understand the struggles that they're facing in their communities in terms of human rights, and helping them frame their struggles in different ways from how they tend to when they're kind of stuck in the local and national policy frameworks that don't really appreciate the value of human rights. Human rights doesn't have the resonance here as elsewhere, and I think that goes back to a long struggle over racial inequities that, of course, Malcolm X was a leader in trying to overturn. And his insights about the possibilities for advancing racial emancipation through the global system, through the system of human rights, got derailed, I think, because of the Cold War and the global interests of the United States, which really led US leaders, starting with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a champion who helped us get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and yet ironically really resisted the extension of our thinking about human rights to racial justice. And this slide, two slides I'm going to show, draw from some of the human rights education work we're doing with community organizers who are really coming to us with the question of, they see the value now, especially with the Trump election. We're seeing much more interest and curiosity about the possibilities for human rights as an organizing framework, but a lack of understanding of what it means and what the potential is. So we've been doing webinars around this to help support and encourage local organizers to do what we say is bring human rights home, bring human rights into their communities, and translate these ideas into the struggles that are really defined by local structures and local contexts. So I just have one more slide that kind of summarizes how we try to show organizers, the opportunities and potentials of thinking globally and thinking about the global history of racial justice struggles, and help them learn that struggles in the United States over racial justice were always looking outside the United States. It wasn't just Malcolm X who had that strategic thinking, but the early NAACP was involved in the We Charge Genocide resolution that went to the UN General Assembly in 1951. This initiative really was behind the creation of the first international human rights treaty that the United States has that was written and the US is party to, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So there's always been effort to address US racial struggles in the global context. It just hasn't really been part of the popular grassroots efforts for largely political, economic reasons. But I think that it's a long and interesting history that historians have traced, and we try to help people see that there is a past and a tradition that we can learn from and build on. A lot of the work that we do with the Human Rights Cities Alliance, and we work closely with the US Human Rights Network, which has really been an organization that centers the black leadership and low-income folks, the folks that have been most denied their human rights. And it's been an organization that's working to help connect grassroots struggles with the United Nations and help local organizers better understand the UN, and it actually brings delegations to international human rights council meetings and to these treaty review processes, and helps them bring their stories there. So, so the international treaty system and the three major treaties that the United States has ratified, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Convention Against Torture, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, are all places where we have opportunities and where activists have advanced claims. And the Universal Periodic Review, the UPR, is the newest process that we can engage with that covers all human rights treaties and standards. So it's not limited to the formal mechanisms that states have formally ratified, but it covers a whole range of customary human rights law. And we're working to, through what we're calling the UPR cities process, to help engage local communities in that than that review of the United States that's happening right now this year. So that's been an interesting process and really involving human rights learning and helping more grassroots organizers learn about the UN. The UN system of special rapporteurs is also a newer development in the 2000s after the creation of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And that these rapporteurs have been really active in advancing racial justice questions in different areas of health, housing, and then there's some rapporteurs that are focused specifically on racial inequities. And most of them spend a lot of their time engaging with civil society groups and local groups and helping also do this work of education and translation. And finally, I think helping people in the United States especially learn about the World Conferences Against Racism, and especially the most recent one that's been largely blotted out of our national memory, but it's that when we go outside the United States and in particular communities, there's a lot of excitement around it and a lot of recognition that it was a significant international event. And part of its significance is what it generated. So it led to the creation of the International Decade on People of African Descent and an expert working group on people of African descent that continue the work of monitoring and reporting on conditions that people of the African diaspora face. And those processes have a lot more potential than for advancing racial justice struggles globally, but also within our own communities. And I think just one more point about what this does is it helps folks think about the struggle for racial justice as not one that they're engaged with in this really hostile context in the United States, but they have solidarity with a global diaspora, and African countries have stepped up and creating the recent urgent debate at the UN Human Rights Council. And the larger global diaspora of people of African descent are part of this same struggle. And so it's taking a little work for people to wrap their minds around that global identity and what it means politically. But I think once people are part of this process, it's pretty interesting to see how they think about themselves as their identity shifts from being a Black person in the United States, for instance, to part of this very powerful movement that has authority and legitimacy in the United Nations and in the African countries that have come together to stand behind this. So that's what I have. I'm happy to share these slides that have more resources and links to all these treaty bodies. And but I will turn over the floor now to the other panelists.
Thank you for that, for setting that up for us, Professor Smith. So I'm going to laugh at my own plan because I want to pick up where you ended, and I hope you're ready, Dr. Dean Celestine-Donner, and because Professor Smith just ended by talking about the African diaspora and how as the work in the cities are taking shape, people are not just identifying with the civil rights movement. In fact, they're identifying with the human rights struggle of people of African descent all across the world. So, and I know you have thoughts about that. So this seems like a natural segue to your thoughts on thinking about how in America, Black and brown people approaching the struggle through the lens of civil rights might have disconnected them from the rest of the people in the African diaspora.
Yeah, sure. Can everyone hear me okay? So I think that, when I think about the language of human rights versus civil rights, I think as a non-American Black person in this country, as an immigrant, I think that the way that civil rights has operated primarily has really been grounded in a lot of things around people who get get rights because of their citizenship, and Black people in particular, right? And so I think a lot of the conversation and debate has been focused on, yes, the push for racial justice, but also, you know, things that might be around equal protection, voting, those types of things. And I think that what that sometimes does is leave out some of the issues when we don't use the language of, I think, human rights, which is broader in my opinion. Sometimes it focuses civil rights as a term, tends to hone in specifically on issues that I think that impact in a very specific way Black Americans. That's not to say that it doesn't impact Black folks from across the diaspora, but I think about immigration as an example, right? And I think of being a Black immigrant and how I feel like there's a civil rights discussion, there's an immigrant discussion, but that you have a large group of people who are Black immigrants, right? And don't often get folded into the conversation around civil rights. And I do think that civil rights I do think that immigration should be in that discussion. But I think that the way that we have historically think about and conceptualize civil rights, it to me feels very grounded around citizenship and the issues that could affect Black Americans in particular. So for me, when we think about this language, when we use human rights, it feels more inclusive to really fold in and include those that are across the diaspora, I think, in a way that allows us to really hone into the issues that affect us more broadly. And even when we think about, you know, racial justice issues, I think that some of the issues that Black folks that are not American face, even as it relates to racial justice, may be a little bit different. And as I mentioned, thinking about someone who is a Black immigrant, right? So you're thinking about issues around racial justice and your race. You're also facing a lot of xenophobia. And so how do we have conversations where we are addressing those things simultaneously, I think will really happen in sort of this human rights perspective, because it focuses not just on what is important to you through citizenship, but what is important to you as a human being, just because you are one. And I think I'll stop there. And if there are other things, you know, chime in later.
Okay. Thank you for that. I should point out that we share the same country of birth, country of origin. I also am an immigrant to the United States. I'm of course now a United States citizen, and I've been so for a long time. In fact, I've lived more of my life in the United States than I live in my country of origin, Trinidad and Tobago. But I spent all of my formative years in Trinidad and Tobago and came here to go to college. So I was fully formed with my ideas and thinking on how I was socialized to human rights. And I shared with some members of the panel when we got together to do a little bit of planning ahead for this conversation, that one of the things I struggled with very early on in college was when I engaged with my African-American brothers and sisters in the conversation around civil rights. And again, I was still relatively new to the country. And I would often find myself not quite on the same page with them. They're not on the same page with me. They're saying to me, I don't quite understand their struggle and so on. And it wasn't until very much later that I realized that I was thinking and talking in terms of human rights, because when I was growing up, I saw what was happening in South Africa. I evaluated that through the human rights lens, not a civil rights lens. And of course, the African-American experience was different. Their struggle was through the lens of civil rights. So even though we were talking essentially about the same thing, we were talking about it and looking at it through different lenses and having a different understanding. And it caused us to have a disconnect, you know, to the point where they were saying, you don't understand the American struggle. I'm like, yeah, I don't. Because as far as I'm concerned, how is the struggle different from the struggle, you know, in South Africa, and so on. And it was really an interesting, for me, evolution, understanding that there's a different thinking around civil rights than the one I was accustomed to when growing up, or socialized to growing up. So, Professor McClain, I want to turn to you because in our preparatory conversation, you had some thoughts about how American exceptionalism influences the lens, and it might, so this might also lead into what we were talking about before. Talk to us about what you mean by that. What's your thinking on that?
So thank you, Dr. Ward. Imagine if we looked at another country, any other country on the planet, and we saw the following. We saw that they had a multi-hundred-year history of oppressing a particular group or groups, that even after succumbing to political pressure for equality, the country still found ways to oppress those groups systematically by occupying their neighborhoods with police, arresting and imprisoning them, passing laws that discriminate against them, immersing them in poverty, making it difficult as possible for them to get out of poverty, and keeping those groups under a pervasive system of oppression. Indeed, imagine that we looked at this other country and we saw them sending police or military forces to squash protest, to threaten criminal prosecution for sedition of protesters seeking to break these bonds of oppression. Further, imagine that this other country had an epidemic of killings of those oppressed persons by private citizens and public actors, often without consequence. And we even hear stories and see images of public officials and private actors mistreating, harming, humiliating, and even murdering those from the oppressed groups, shooting them, choking them, putting hoods over their heads and suffocating them, unshackling them in the back of police vans and then driving in a way to injure them and resulting in their deaths. I don't think that we'd have any trouble at all concluding that we were staring at a human rights crisis. And it seems to me then that it begs the question, why wouldn't we look at the United States through that same lens? So my thinking on why I brought up the notion of American exceptionalism is this. America loves to place its imprimatur on the world, but it doesn't so much like subjecting itself to the control or influence of others. We love to liberate, right, as it were. We love to bring democracy to the world, but we don't enjoy subjecting ourselves to international law. We have no problem sanctioning other countries for their treatment of citizens, for their misbehavior. But America views itself as exceptionally sovereign, in the sense that it does not wish to be subject to the judgment of those outside of our country. And I might even go so far as to say that the United States is hostile towards any notion of an external, a foreign standard of conduct. In recent years, actually, we've seen calls for impeachment of judges or justices who might rely upon international law in their decision making. And so I think it reflects this idea that America views itself as being outside of the notion of human rights. And so it restricts the ability of those fighting against oppression when we try to use a human rights lens to look at these problems, because the United States often just won't submit to human rights standards, to externally imposed standards. That said, to go back to the quote from Malcolm X, if we are thinking in terms of human rights, these are things that we are born with, right? So maybe these things aren't things that are externally imposed, but indeed those things to which every human being is entitled. And perhaps we should think as much as we can about shifting the conversation to look at to look at these problems with that lens.
I'll say thank you, Professor McClain, and we stay in the School of Law and now turn to our colleague, Professor Danchin, to help us, if at all possible, draw some parallels, speak in terms of some contradictions, in terms of this conversation around human rights with the killing of George Floyd and how that killing and his brother's action in terms of going before the Human Rights Council in Geneva to speak about that killing might have propelled the movement around his killing out of the narrow civil rights discourse into a more human rights one.
Thank you. Yes, well, I'm delighted to be joining this conversation. And I should say, before I make some remarks, I have two interesting aspects to my background, which I think inform my thinking, which is I actually grew up in South Africa during the apartheid years, and that had a very formative influence on me in thinking about human rights. And I've followed the developments, of course, in South Africa in the post-apartheid era. And so I'd like to mention that in a moment. The other perspective I bring is as an international human rights lawyer, and this fascination or this disconnect that each of the other speakers has identified of this division between conceptions of rights in the US legal system and constitutional order and international human rights. I think it was Michael Ignatieff who observed a few years ago that Americans don't see it this way, but the country with the most puzzling human rights record in the world is its own. And I think Professor McClain tried to describe that disconnect. One of the academics I studied most closely with is Louis Henkin, who's known to all human rights lawyers in the United States. And he had a famous saying, which was that in the US, human rights are for export only. And there is this paradoxical idea or phenomenon that we observe that on the one hand, in this post-Second World War moment, the United States played really the formative role in the creation of the Commission on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Professor Smith mentioned the role of Eleanor Roosevelt, which is rightly celebrated, I think, in the United States. So on the one hand, there is this remarkable movement and expression of building at the international level that occurs after the Second World War, but simultaneously there is this remarkable effort to make sure that none of that architecture, whether normative or institutional, has any effect in the United States itself. And this is something that I've studied through my work. There was just one observation I wanted to make on this, and then three illustrations of the point. Some historians have done really fascinating archival work, particularly in the records of the State Department in the period immediately after the war, between about 1945 and 1953, when the Eisenhower administration began. And some of the debates that occurred in that period about US involvement in the new United Nations and the human rights bodies that were being formed, I think give us some answer to this paradox and help to explain why we have the system that we have today. And interestingly, two things emerged from those debates. One, of course, were efforts to shield practices in the United States. Here, the role of the Southern Democrats, of course, is very, very important. But just to mention a few of the concerns, Southern justice, Jim Crow, internment of the Japanese, genocide of Native Americans, death slavery, racist immigration laws, and so on. There was a remarkable amount of practices, of course, in that period of time, many of which continue, that could become subject to scrutiny at the international level. And we now know from those debates that there was an effort on the one hand to participate in these bodies, but then to shield those practices from any real scrutiny. And regrettably, Eleanor Roosevelt played a strong role in that shielding. Interestingly, one of the debates talks about an effort that she joined with Texas Senator John Connally to thwart a complaint being brought to the new United Nations, charging South Africa with systematic racial discrimination and human rights violations. And Roosevelt and Connally worked behind the scenes to thwart that complaint being brought. Of course, South Africa was one of only 8 countries that voted against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But the real concern we know from those debates was that if that kind of investigation could be launched in international bodies, there was a fear that the UN might start investigating, in the words of the day, the condition of Negroes in Alabama. And so the kind of disconnect we have is not an accident. It was a matter of conscious policy. So that history, I think, is really important to recover, and I think it deserves to be told alongside of the civil rights movement, trying to draw out some of these connections and disconnects that occurred at the time. And I don't have time to go into all of that now. But there are three observations then that emerge from this history. The first is that the language of human rights, in a sense, became a victim of the onset of the Cold War. And any attempt to articulate issues of education, of housing, of healthcare, of the right to work, social security, what we regard as economic and social rights, were immediately associated with communism, discredited, and even US civil rights organizations like the NAACP resorted exclusively to the language of civil rights. The language of human rights was self-consciously excluded, not just by state actors, but also by civil society organizations like the NAACP, who made a strategic calculation that the language of civil rights was more likely to be effective. So the kind of ballad of the bullets quote that we started with was certainly not the mainstream discourse of the day. And the idea then of the struggle for human rights in the United States has not really begun in that sense, because these issues of systematic discrimination in education, in housing, in healthcare, in all these other social domains remain worse in many respects and worsening, as Professor McClain mentioned. And then the two others, just very quickly, one is the relentless language of individual rights. Any notion of minority rights or collective cultural conceptions of belonging was systematically blocked by the United States at the international level. And in fact, in one of the State Department documents, the State Department concluded there are probably no national minorities in the United States. So any attempt to define minority rights in international law were thought to not include any minority claims or group claims in the United States. And again, there's a fascinating history behind that. And then lastly, as a legal matter, two things that international lawyers constantly note. The first was to make sure that any international bodies that were created had very limited enforcement powers. And of course, were subject to a whole range of limitations in their jurisdiction. So there was a domestic jurisdiction clause put into the UN Charter, Article 2.7. And the idea, at least in the early days, was that human rights were a matter of domestic concern only. And that, interestingly, the debates reflect this was a key concern of the United States at the time. So the sort of relative lack of enforcement powers in the Human Rights Council today, or the other treaty bodies that we have, like the Human Rights Committee, are not accidents. They were conscious policies to seek to ensure that these rights could not be adjudicated under US law. So this leaves us with a last point, which is law in the United States. And Professor Smith mentioned the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which has had such powerful effects in other countries like Australia, where I lived for many years. The US ratification of that treaty is non-self-executing, so it cannot be invoked in a US court. There is no implementing legislation, like most of the other treaties, with the exception of the Torture Convention. And there's no robust participation by the United States in the international human rights bodies that monitor that treaty. So in effect, the Racial Discrimination Convention has had very limited impact, extremely limited impact as a matter of domestic US law. And then last, and most glaring, I think, for all of this conversation, is that the United States remains not a party to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is half of the International Bill of Rights. So just for those who don't know, those treaties each have over 176 state parties, but the US remains an exceptional outlier on the issue of economic and social rights. And even today, as we know, issues like health are resisted in terms of the language of invoking the right to health care as a human right. So what has changed, of course, in the world is that the Cold War is long over, and that ideological antagonism that led to this artificial division has long disappeared in the social democracies of what's often called the Western world. And yet the United States still resists thinking about these questions in terms of substantive equality and human rights. And it's that reality, I think, we struggling with today when we talk about racism and struggles for racial justice in the US.
Thank you, Peter. Interesting indeed. And I think, of course, the obvious needs to be stated, which is that to the extent that the US hasn't yet signed on to a lot of these human rights conventions and treaties and what have you, that's been true Democratic and Republican administrations. So it's an American paradox, truly, that cuts across political ideologies. And so, Professor Smith, we have about 15 minutes left. I saw you taking notes, and as the guest, I want to give you an opportunity to try to stitch together some of the things you would have heard, especially since you went first, and then try to honor Virginia's request to leave about 10 minutes for questions. I see a couple already popped up in the chat. Peter, you might have already answered one of them. So Professor Smith, any thoughts on what the other panelists said after you?
So I guess I always like to leave people with some hope. And one thing that I didn't share about where I sit in the human rights work is that I think we're living in a really interesting time when the global human rights movement is becoming more local. And I think the shift happened at the World Conference in Vienna in 1993 was where civil society actors, but also folks working in the UN who are realizing this problem that we've pointed to today, that the most powerful nations and countries in general weren't very good. They would sign treaties, but they're not very good at following through. And there's a recognition that recognition of the insight that I think Frederick Douglass lifted up, that people in power never cede power without a demand. And that demand requires popular mobilization. And we draw from Frederick Douglass in our slogan that we use in our Human Rights Cities movement. And we say, human rights don't trickle down, they rise up. And so what the Human Rights Cities movement is a reflection of a global movement that's really rising in cities and communities around the world where people are claiming rights to the city and using human rights language to make demands for housing and healthcare and water and utilities and education. So we're seeing real transformation in how human rights organizing is happening. It's focused less on getting new treaties and machinery at the UN level and more on bringing that home. And the Human Rights Cities movement kind of reflects that and really working to translate some of these ideas and make So there's lots of problems with enforcement. But what we're doing is what one of my co-organizers likes to say, at the community level, we are the enforcers. We're the ones who have to document violations and bring those to the UN. And what's fascinating is the evolution of the machinery and the introduction of the special rapporteurs and the Universal Periodic Review in particular has depoliticized some of the monitoring and enforcement of human rights and created more space for civil society groups to engage with those mechanisms and to connect both with leaders in the United Nations. So our grassroots struggles, we can talk with other national delegates through the Universal Periodic Review process and the Human Rights Council and engage with those folks because of the special rapporteurs, because of the structure of the Human Rights Council and the various monitoring mechanisms and the organizational relationships that have been built through like the US Human Rights Network and the Human Rights Cities movement. So while that's all happened under the radar of a lot of scholars, it's really reflects a process of international law from below. And I think that's where I see some hope that human rights can really matter. But it takes work like folks here are doing and helping make clear some of this history and help folks at the grassroots organizing level see where those connections are and how to make them and make their voices heard outside of the context of the US where they may be less resonant than in some of these global spaces where we can then boomerang back into the United States and have a real influence on policy as other global leaders look and point to the US and say, we want to see you do better and we're going to put pressure on you in different ways to make sure that you improve in these regards.
Thank you. Neijma, I'm looking at the Black Lives Matter sign behind you, and I'm just wondering, and any one of the panelists could chime in on this, and then we'll of course take questions, but I'm just wondering if the movement, Black Lives Matter movement, have begun to talk in terms of human rights as opposed to just civil rights. Is it evolving that way? And with the work that's happening in the cities that you talked about, Professor Smith, what is the likelihood of these two movements sort of intersecting and becoming not necessarily one, but a force in the same direction using a shared language?
So I can chime in really quickly. I do think that it's really important for the Black Lives Matter movement to approach their struggle from this international viewpoint, because I think it really will allow for the opportunity to really fold in Black allies all across the diaspora, and then it doesn't just become sort of this like local domestic issue, and it is really broad. And so I have definitely seen, and I know in the country that I'm from, even seeing folks talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think that the folks that lead this have done, I think, some more intentional work of approaching this from sort of this international human rights viewpoint, as opposed to some earlier movements. So kind of like what Dr. Smith is saying, with this hope, I am hopeful in terms of what I am seeing, particularly with this movement. And I do think we will begin to see more conversations around this idea of it not being this domestic agenda, but more of an international agenda that focuses on all Black folks across the diaspora, that really allows us to not just be subject to this US system and US aid, but really to get and build more allies. So I think it's important, and I do see some initial things happening.
you. Thank you. Virginia, you popped up for a minute there. So I'm assuming you wanted to take questions. So let's do that.
Yes, I'm just looking at the questions. Some came up in the chat and some were sent to me privately. Several have to do with sort of the practical policy implications that we've understood the background here, the purposeful divergence that Professor Danchin discussed. And then Professor Smith did talk about some of the grassroots efforts she's taking, but there's some questions around how do we move away from this exceptionalism? Is it a problem? This might be a question for you, Peter, or Russell, that the human rights isn't incorporated to our laws, so people can't go to the courts to realize their rights. I guess the sense is, what is the next step now that we understand this background? Are there any practical interventions, and what are they?
Russell, how about you lead off?
Yes, I'll jump in and then I'll let the real international lawyer give you the hit the home run. I did read a question in the chat that quoted Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I wanted to respond by saying, you know, I don't think there's any question, right, that America has been built on the back of slavery, genocide, and oppression, or to say on a foundation of trampling human rights. I don't think that's disputable. And I think that surely provides a moral justification for us to recognize human rights in this country. As a lawyer, you know, I guess I would say that the moral justification doesn't always lead to legal justification, right? And I think that America's economic superiority has allowed it the luxury of avoiding the scrutiny of the international community. Others may denounce what they see, but there are few teeth, few ways to really bring the U.S. to task for its persistent violation of human rights. With that, I'll hand it over to Professor Danchin.
Yeah, so just three quick thoughts. Of course, these are huge questions, but just in terms of how I think about them, I think one of the things we're actually seeing in the United States, at least legally, is a raging debate about how we understand the Constitution, the United States Constitution. And this is playing out in multiple domains, but it's quite obvious to any outsider that there is a kind of constitutional fundamentalism in the United States. And this has some positive aspects to it in the sense that, you know, the rights in the Bill of Rights are given strong force as in law in many ways better than in other parts of the world. But where this becomes problematic is when it becomes inward looking and entirely non-dialogic, where ideas of rights become stuck in a single national conception or framework, and where there's a sort of unwillingness to engage horizontally or with others about both the meaning of rights and the interpretation of those rights in this broader context. So I think this is one of the struggles that we see going on, right? We see, for example, statements in the public sphere that the 1619 Project is a threat to civilization itself, and that we need to shore up the foundations of the constitutional order. And that's really code for not talking about international law or human rights at all. In fact, many may be aware that the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, launched an initiative in the State Department just this year to create a new commission on inalienable rights, which is an attempt to rethink what human rights mean in US foreign policy and by implication domestic law in terms of 18th century natural law understandings of natural rights, and to resist the move towards thinking about human rights in the way it's evolved in the post-war period. And this really is a fascinating phenomenon to observe, that really this, the role of the US in creating and helping to build this post-war movement of international human rights law has reached this absurd point now, where there's an almost complete disconnect between these two ideas or ways of thinking about rights. So I think at the constitutional level, which is also a cultural level, there has to be an awakening of consciousness around what I think people understand by the US Constitution and constitutional system. Secondly, and just very quickly, at least in human rights scholarship, there's a fascinating debate occurring at the moment, largely spurred by scholars like Samuel Moyn, historian, noting that the human rights movement has traveled very comfortably with the dramatic rise in economic inequality in the world. And so the sort of conjoining of neoliberalism with human rights thinking has been something that's gone unchallenged largely in US policy. And we're seeing the devastating effects of that, not just in the United States, but internationally as well. And so again, a conversation has to occur, has to really happen within human rights movements and organizations themselves about what we mean by economic equality and social equality. And again, the role of economic and social rights and the law and thinking around that has really not even begun, I think, in the United States. And last, and Professor Smith's point about human rights from below, I think these initiatives to conjoin international work that's being done with social movements, with cities, with human rights clinics, the bringing human rights home efforts that are occurring in the United States are extremely important. So I think particularly about the Poor People's Campaign, actually, that I think is just a remarkable social movement that directly employs the language of human rights. And I think those kinds of grassroots movements should be encouraged and hopefully will build strength over the coming years. But I agree, that is where the hope lies, I think, in the United States.
Can I just add one more concept for folks to think about that comes from the movement struggles, and also as a sociologist to counter some of the lawyer talk here and the ways lawyers tend to think about human rights. The technocratic and legalistic approach to human rights is really rejected by a lot of the folks that I work with, and they embrace what's called a people-centered human rights framework and concept of human rights that says human rights are not based in the law. The law comes from our struggles and our understandings of rights, which grow out of human needs and struggle. And so the center is not on what laws exist, but what we need to achieve the needs that we have as community and as individuals, and what we're ready to work for. So I think people-centered human rights is a really useful concept for us to add to our thinking about the human rights movement, because that movement did not ignore economic and social and cultural rights, even though on the legal and academic front, I think Professor Danchin's point is really well taken.
Virginia?
Yeah, I think we have 2 minutes, and here's a huge question. I think you can see it in the chat to all the panelists, especially Professor McClain. Is Black Lives Matter ready to talk more broadly about a human rights perspective when we haven't even achieved civil rights in the US for Black, Brown, and Indigenous people? How do we talk about human rights when our nation doesn't abide by this basic standard that it purports to propagate?
Thanks for directing that especially to me. I'm not sure that I have the answer to the question. I think that, the reason we're having this discussion is to explore the best framework to address the oppression that we see, right? I think that the point of the conversation is that perhaps the framework of civil rights is insufficient to look at the problems that we are facing in the United States, that there is perhaps a weakness in using a civil rights lens, or a myopia maybe of using a civil rights lens exclusively, and that perhaps using a human rights lens to look at and to address these problems can be more effective. So to some degree, I guess I might say that the question betrays to some degree this notion that we must look at these problems as an American problem versus being a human problem.
Yeah, and I would agree, because when we think about Black Lives Matter, I think one fundamental question is who are the Black lives that we're talking about? right? And so that, I mean, I won't go into all of the question, but I think that's a first step, that when we're talking about Black Lives Mattering, are we just talking about the Black lives in US or Black US citizens? So I hate to end on a question, but
Well,
we're just gonna put that out there.
well, let me end on this. So, you know, this book by Professor Carl Anderson is a book I read several years ago. And to the last question and to other questions, I'm sure, it's called Eyes Off the Prize by Carl Anderson. And I actually had it on my bookshelf. And then after our conversation last week, again, a couple of the panelists, I said, let me go, I'm sure I have that. And I had read it a long time ago, and we read portions of it. I couldn't read the whole thing with this new context in mind of the Black Lives Matter movement, everything that has happened in the United States. And for those of you who are interested in the conversation, as Russell was suggesting, the bigger conversation about civil rights versus human rights, Professor Anderson does a remarkable job talking about the history of civil rights, the NAACP, how it started out and how it ended up, and so on. So it's really a highly recommended read on the whole topic of on human rights. So again, panelists, thank you all for taking the time. I said at the outset it was a meaty topic, and I'm not sure we were going to really be able to do the topic justice, but I think I can say we gave it our best shot. And I thank each of you, Professor Smith, Peter, also Neijma, for taking the time to engage in this conversation. Virginia, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, thank you again to the panelists and for participating in this discussion and being part of the graduate school convocation. We're very happy to have this conversation, and thank you, Roger, for moderating. So with that, we'll close, and many thanks again.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.